Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Rice. Thanks for joining us, Will.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, joining you from Missoula, Montana, where not quite the midnight sun, but close to it. I will be out tonight. As Jennifer said, I'm Dr. Will Rice. I'm in the Department of Society and Conservation here at the University of Montana in the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation in the Parks, Tourism, and Recreation Management program, where I direct the Wildland and Recreation Management Research Lab. Tonight, I'll be talking about something very near and dear to my heart, which is campgrounds. So really honored to be here and excited to dive in here. So a little bit about what I do and what our lab does. So we do really applied research, and we come from a really applied field, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But we're folks who are interested in answering questions that land management agencies come to us with. These managers who are managing our national forests, national parks, state parks, community parks, open space, have these management issues, and they need data to inform management moving forward. And so what is really helpful in our lab in terms of managing or answering those questions is that we come from those same agencies. So I worked for the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. Students previously worked as wilderness rangers for the Forest Service or scientists for USGS. And so we have this background that's really rooted in land management on top of everything else we're doing that's really starting to really dive into the research behind some of this. And to just give you a little bit of a breadth of understanding of what we do and where we do it, most of the work we do are applied studies on specific management issues, or maybe just kind of trying to understand basic visitor use patterns. So where are people going? How long are they staying? Why are people coming to these parks? And we do this a lot in national parks, where you're seeing really high demand for recreation, in wilderness, and in places like here in Missoula, the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area, a place that is seeing increased use and sustained use over time and new types of uses. So helping managers understand questions related to that. Some of the work we do is really zoomed in on specific issues in parks. So I'll be talking about some campsite work here today. So that's like one specific arena within park management is campground management. We also do stuff around health and outdoor recreation, outdoor recreation provisions health, as Jennifer mentioned in her introduction. And then we do stuff at really big scales too. So we're doing a project with other collaborators here at the University of Montana where we're looking at how air quality and air pollution driven by wildfire smoke impacts playground and park use across the Intermountain West and the Pacific Northwest. And we just wrapped up, we just published or about to publish our 6th paper, working with some folks at Penn State and the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics, looking at how COVID-19 has impacted outdoor recreation. And so this is kind of, I'm well aware this is a unique research portfolio, right? Like this is probably not a research portfolio you're super familiar with, or maybe hasn't graced the stage at Distinctive Voices before. But I am, if you're curious as to how to kind of what bin to put me in as a scientist, I'm a leisure scientist. I tell this to my students, and I usually show a picture of someone in a leisure suit, and they don't know what a leisure suit is, which is awfully disappointing. And we get this a lot, right? So like, here's an article from Wired saying, hey, they found this journal that has leisure in the title. That's really interesting. And it is. So like, there's actually probably 10 journals that have leisure in the title of them. But essentially, we are this field of academics who study people, what they do in their free time, and the issues that arise from having additional free time and more people having additional free time. And so we're studying things like tourism is kind of the oldest, biggest sibling in the leisure sciences family, major field of study. I am within the subfield of recreation sciences and specifically outdoor recreation research, but there's folks who study play and the philosophy of leisure. Here's a nice quote by Manning, just kind of summing up that we're concerned with this emerging set of issues or problems contemporary society deals with through the productive use of leisure time. Today, we'll be talking about one specific type of leisure, and that's camping. And when I say camping, I mean campground camping. So there's been a lot of research over the decades on wilderness camping, probably because people like me are really interested in wilderness, and people who come into this field are like, oh yeah, wilderness, backpacking, beautiful settings. Campgrounds have kind of been forgotten. We'll talk a little bit about that. But we're going to be specifically talking about campground camping, and that happens in places like this. So the first really outdoor recreation researcher was this guy named E.P. Meideke. Actually, I should really say his full name because it's fantastic. Emilio Pepe Michel Meideke, who was a plant pathologist and botanist and worked for the Forest Service. And whenever sequoias and redwoods started dying, they called on Meideke to go check out these forests and figure out what was going on. He figured people were camping on the root systems and compacting the soil. And so he said, what we really need is a design solution of a campground. And so if you've ever camped in a campground, whether that's in a state park or national park, you've probably camped in a Meideke style campground where you have loops, one-way loops. You have these little campsites where you have your tent pad, your stove, your picnic table, and your little, what he called the garage, this little pull out for your car or RV. And this style of camping is really, just to give you a sense, if those who don't camp, this is what we have all over our national park system and national forest system and state parks. We still have loops and campsites that look just like Meideke designed them. And we'll talk about why that's important here in a little bit. So campgrounds, just to give you a little bit of a peek into the outdoor recreation research literature, campgrounds, you're not going to find a whole lot. Campgrounds have been largely forgotten in research. And it's something I noticed early on in my master's studies. But that said, camping's a really big deal. According to 2021 numbers, 67% of North American residents camp at least occasionally. And the proportion of first-time campers grew by 5 times in 2020. So we're seeing this increase in camping due to this rather safe type of accommodation and recreation you could experience during the pandemic. And dollars certainly aren't everything, but just to put a little bit of a window into there, camping generates $241 billion in economic activity annually in the United States. And just because that's a mind-boggling number, just for reference, US museums generate $62 billion in economic activity. And like I said, numbers aren't everything, dollars aren't everything, but that's significant. And someone who studies camping, I am a little salty. We have like 6, probably at least, journals that a quick Google search can find on museums. We don't have one camping journal. We only have like 2 recreation journals. So that's somewhat upsetting, though understandable. And interestingly, as someone who studies outdoor recreation, and as you may be well aware, outdoor recreation historically is in many activities, white people and white men such as myself are really overrepresented in these spaces. And camping has always, or especially in recent years, been this bright spot where non-white participation is fairly representative of the larger population. So in 2021, 37% of campers in the US were non-white, compared to 36% of US residents being non-white. So pretty representative in terms of at least non-white representation in camping. Importantly, if we look at folks who aren't campers yet or aren't outdoor recreationists at all, and we look at those incomes under $75,000, camping is in the top 2 of the activities they are interested in participating in, along with fishing. These 2 activities are typically have the most representative participation across ethnicities and income as well. So people want to camp who aren't currently camping if they're going to enter outdoor recreation. So I kind of dove into this world of camping. Really, it was kind of on a lark. I saw a webinar about a new data set, and I kind of wanted to dive into it when I was a master's student. And my colleagues, So-Young Park and Bing Pan and Peter Newman, wrote a paper where we were like, okay, camping hasn't gotten much research. It's not getting much love. Let's just do an exploratory paper on this new data set, which had data on every reservation made on Recreation.gov, which is the federal website where you can make campground reservations. And so we were interested, okay, let's see, campground demand is surging, as we just talked about. Let's see if we can predict future demand using historical data and trends and fit a forecasting model. And so we picked a bunch of campgrounds that had lots of data across the US in multiple settings, all in national parks. And we decided to test which forecasting method, based on all sorts of forecasting methods that have been identified in the tourism literature, work best to understand the distinctive behavior of campers and camping tourists. So camping is a little different than, for instance, So Young and Bing do a lot of work in commercial tourism, dealing with hotels, resorts, those sorts of things. It's a little easier to predict those. Camping, if it rains, a lot of people aren't going to be camping. They're much more sensitive to seasonality and weather, so it's a harder model to fit. So it's quite a challenge. We took about 3 million, I guess 3.5 million reservations across 108 campgrounds initially to start training our models. And then we did an in-depth study of 5 popular US campgrounds that had lots of data over time. And we found that this ensemble model, and I'm not going to go into the details there, but was the most accurate. Essentially, we were able to take millions of data points, look at all the camping happening in national parks using historical data, and then create a new model. From there, So Young, my colleague at Florida Atlantic University, and I decided we should take a deep dive. We had this huge spatial scale. We were looking across the country at all these different campgrounds. What if we just had one campground and then looked at the campsites? And this is something that, this was not an original idea by any means. Here's a paper from Franke and McLaughlin in 1982, and there's a number of models that were created like this because this is a common management question. Like I said, this is an applied field. And so how do people make decisions as to where to camp, what campsite to choose? This is kind of anyone who's camped before has had to make this decision, like which campsite do I pick? If there's more than one option to choose from. And so historically, we've been doing this via stated preference. So we've been asking people, what about this campsite made you pick it? Or what do you want? What do you look for in a campsite? Do you look for shade? Do you look for solitude? Do you look for proximity to the bathroom? That's like the big one, right? Like you want to be close enough to the bathroom to like get there in the middle of the night if you need to, but you don't want to be so close that you're smelling it and hearing it all night, right? And so we were interested, because we have all this reservation data, we're able to see which sites book first. We're actually to have what we call revealed preference data. So actually seeing the data after people make their choice. And so we took all the reservations from Watchman Campground in Zion National Park, an extremely highly demanded campground where the campsites are available far in advance for reservation on Recreation.gov. We took an analysis, we took 25,000 reservations. We looked at different components of the setting of the campground. So in outdoor recreation research, we talked about the 3 components of the setting: social, ecological, managerial. And we looked at things like, are they accessible to an RV? Do they have electricity? Do you have to walk to the site, or can you actually just drive into the site? How close are you to the river? How close are you to the bathroom? Those sorts of things. We created a spatial regression model, and we found that access to electricity, proximity to the river, the view shed of the individual campsite, and walk-in or drive-in up designations, whether you could drive your car up to the site or not, were significant predictors of which sites booked first. And you can see this map is just a representation of that. Interestingly, proximity to neighbors, proximity to bathrooms had no effect. So people weren't afraid to be crowded. People weren't afraid to be too close to the bathroom. But what really stuck out for me, like this was a really fascinating study. It got a lot of attention, which is really exciting. But at the end of the day, so we found that the average booking window, campsites in Zion in Watchman Campground are booked 102 days in advance on average, 102 days. Like that's a pretty big span. Like in elementary school, we had like 100-day, right? Where it felt like an eternity to get to 100-day, the 100th day of school. That's a lot of days, more than 3 months. And so this kind of spoke to this issue of like, wow, like there's a lot of demand here and you have to book really far ahead to get one of these campsites. And then in 2021, I saw this statistic not long after we published that paper. And I'll read this in full because it's just really startling. This is coming directly from Recreation.gov, so directly from the federal government. A popular campground with 57 campsites can see close to 19,000 people all trying to reserve the same campsites for the same dates immediately after the release for reservation. So 57 campsites, 19,000 people. If you are one of those people who can be at your computer immediately after those campsites are made available, you have a 0.3% chance of getting a campsite. Just like let that wash over you for a second. Like, I mean, I told someone recently, like your chance of getting Beyonce tickets are better. Like this is a crazy number. And so we started thinking, my collaborators here at the University of Montana, we started talking about this, and it's like, wow, like so many things matter at that stage, like the speed of your internet, the ability to be off work and have free time to be at your computer at that time, having multiple friends around the country also trying to book that campsite at the same time in case you don't get it. Like social networks matter, social capital matters, so much matters when you have a 0.3% chance, every little bit matters. And then we started seeing stuff like this, which you may have seen too, like Outside Magazine. I feel like every week puts out an article on what they're calling the campsite shortage problem, or KQED in the Bay Area putting out stories about the possibility of bots being on Rec.gov. I'm not saying there are bots on Rec.gov, but just the fear of bots could make people less likely to even try to book a campsite. And then I'm getting ads like this for services like CampNav, which for a fee a month will help you get that campsite through sending you text messages as soon as there's been a cancellation. And then I read this book, which is excellent, by Dr. Phoebe Young at the University of Colorado, which goes through the whole history of camping and national park camping, and really dives into the leisure aspect of it, which I love as a leisure scientist, of course. And then here in my neck of the woods at Glacier National Park, they moved to a lottery system, or sorry, a reservation system for 2 other campgrounds that were previously first come, first serve in the past year. So we're seeing, and this is happening nationally, this sweep of campsites going to Recreation.gov that used to be first come, first serve. And then that statistic that, like, all of this kept rattling around in my brain, like this 0.3% chance of getting a campsite. And so my colleagues, Dr. Jen Thompson, Jacqueline Rushing, Peter Whitney, we started diving into literature. But surely, I mean, we feel like we know the literature pretty well, but like surely someone has studied this. And we found this really dusty report from 1976 when we first started having campsite reservation systems, and a social scientist with the Forest Service said, we should go see what people think. And he asked really good questions around equity. So he found that only 34% of campers in California had jobs that allowed them to plan 12 weeks in advance. So here, that's 84 days. We know now that to get a campsite in Zion National Park, for instance, like you better be able to plan 102 days in advance. And back then, we don't have any more updated numbers than this because there's been such limited research on camping, but 34% of people were able to do that. And now, like I mentioned, there's so many more hurdles in order to get that reservation because the demand is so high and the booking is so instantaneous. And then Phoebe Young's research, Dr. Young's research really started to inspire our work. We were passing this book around. Dr. Young talks about how camping was originally conceived by this Northeastern leisure class after the Civil War. And as people from middle classes started to camp as a way to, find cheap accommodation during vacation, the leisure class started this like counter effort to really reappropriate camping as this conspicuous activity that, showed everyone that they were wealthy. They would bring Persian rugs camping. That's how camping in the US started. And then what was really interesting, given as someone who researches the national parks, Dr. Young goes into the history of NPS campground designs and that Meineke design, and how Meineke was actually getting pressure to design these campgrounds to emulate the suburbs that a post-war white America was moving to. And so they were explicitly designing these campgrounds to be spaces where white people would be comfortable. And national park camping remains exclusionary. So you may remember at the top, I mentioned that camping as a whole is kind of this bright spot, this one place that we can find pretty representative participation across the American public. But in terms of camping in national parks specifically, we find a study in 2018 found that median household income of national park campers was $4,000 higher on average than the larger US population. And the rise of these startups that will charge you an extra fee in order to make this public, to help you make this public campground reservation through sending you an alert whenever cancellation or a site becomes available, that's adding an additional financial burden and potentially pushing some people out of the market for a campsite. And so to dive in, I'm not going to dive too deep into the theory here. I'm going to keep it pretty general, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about theory because as a social scientist who doesn't love to talk about theory, what we use to frame the research I'm about to present is this framework of distributive justice. And this was really conceived in the recreation literature by this person, Bo Shelby, who is a professor at Oregon State University. in the 80s, whenever rivers were starting to move to reservation-only systems. And Bo talks about the need to think about 4 tenets when making decisions about how to allocate recreation resources and how to do that in a fair way. So this is all based on the concept that people should, that it should be a fair means of allocating these public goods, right? This isn't a competitive market. This is supposed to be a public market. So Bo talks about equality, equity, need, and efficiency. And he even talks about, ways the trade-offs between these. And so he notes that he and his colleagues note that reservation systems seek to maximize equality, assuming everyone has equal chance to plan ahead, which we know from McGill's work that just is not the case. Not everyone does have an equal chance to plan ahead, but assuming that they do, it maximizes equality. And then need, equity, efficiency, those are generally failed in terms of how they're addressed through a reservation system. And so, for instance, need, if you camp in a national park, anyone can camp in an accessible site, so a handicapped accessible site. That can be a really good thing from an equity standpoint. You don't have to show any proof. It reduces those barriers, but people who potentially don't need those amenities are getting them, while those who do need them may be left out. The other theory that we use to really dive into this is environmental justice. And this comes from the work of Cassandra Johnson and Myron Floyd, who really took outdoor recreation, kind of shook the field of scientists and said, we really need to think about environmental justice in terms of outdoor recreation. In 2002, they wrote a pretty seminal paper on this, saying we often think about environmental injustices in terms of exposure to bad things, right? And exposure to mines or landfills or chemical leaches. But we should also think about the good things and the lack of exposure to good things. Things like parks, things like forests, street trees, those sorts of things. And so this is just a quote in terms of what they think we should be thinking about in natural resource management in terms of environmental justice. And the last one here, well, I guess I should maybe go through to B here first. Things should be distributed fairly, and citizens should have equal access to public resources. Something that based on all this we're hearing about campgrounds, we were wondering whether that was happening. And access, importantly, in the leisure studies, we really think about access not just in terms of physical access, but a much more nuanced concept. And so there's different types of constraints to access that we see, right? Intrapersonal constraints, things like fear, not feeling welcome in a space. Interpersonal constraints, not having companions to participate in outdoor recreation with, a family, or being part of a culture that those things are just not popular or done. And then structural constraints, fees that are too high, parks not close enough to you, the allocation strategy not fitting your needs, the lack of education about how to access this. And so if you can kind of think about this as like Will's brain soup, like this is like what's going on in my mind, and I'm sharing this with my colleagues, Jen, Jacqueline, and Peter, and we're like, we should really look at this. All of these things, the boom of camping, the theory, the lack of previous research, like all of this is leading to this question of, is current National Park Service campsite allocation exclusionary? So we crafted the following research questions that are really going to guide the rest of my talk here. So we decided to look at national park campgrounds, and obviously we couldn't look at all of them, and I'll talk about why that is in a second, but we wanted to look at those campsites that required reservations and the people camping in those campsites. And we wanted to look to see if they were coming from areas or home locales with higher median household incomes and higher proportions of white residency than those camping in campsites not accepting reservations, those available on a first come, first served basis. And if that's a little unclear at the moment, I'll bring some clarity to that in a second. All right, so it was pretty difficult to find these campgrounds. So we had some pretty strong criteria. One, spoiler alert, we're going to use cell phone data to look at people's demographics. So we had a good cell phone coverage by at least 3 providers because we didn't want it to be economically biased. And so a lot of campgrounds don't have really good cell phone coverage in 2019, especially when we pulled this data, or we pulled the data from. We needed some campsites available on a first come first serve basis where you could just walk up and get that campsite, assuming it was available, or wait in line the morning of in order to get a campsite, and some available on a reservation only basis via Recreation.gov in 2019. And after looking across the country and talking to people in the Park Service and using their campground finder tool, we identified 5 campgrounds that met that criteria. And here they are. Not going to go too deep into this. One thing to note here, only one of the campgrounds is really urban proximate. There aren't a whole lot of national park campgrounds in urban proximate locations. This one's just outside DC in Prince William Forest Park, Oak Ridge Campground. All right, so here's where it gets a little technical. So we had our campgrounds, and now we needed to extract the data of where people were coming from to visit those campgrounds in service of our research questions, because again, our research questions were asking, what are there differences between the people camping in 2 different types of campgrounds, campsites. The campsites being identical, other than the fact that some of them were reserved beforehand on Recreation.gov and some were available on a first come first serve basis. So we turned to a vendor that the University of Montana has a contract with, Near Vista, which has a panel of about 30% of US mobile phone users. And they collect location data from people's phones that you consent to potentially having your location on your weather app or Pokemon Go, or maybe it's on Google Chrome or Safari on your phone, and it's a web browser and there's an ad that's picking up your location, and then they're turning around and selling that location to Near Vista and a bunch of other vendors, I might add. So to just give you an idea what this looks like, we're looking at common evening locations of campers. So where do these campers, for instance, here in Saddlehorn Campground, which is about right here in Colorado National Monument near Grand Junction, we're looking at where their phones spend the night most nights, and that becomes a proxy for their home location. And so here are the common evening locations of campers in the across Saddlehorn Campground in 2019. You can see the Front Range in Denver having a really high density of users. Southern California, the Bay Area, Portland, Seattle, big cities, Minneapolis, Salt Lake, and then scattered across rural America as well. And then a big contingency here in Colorado, but this shows where people are coming from to camp in the campground. So then we took that data and we split it by the type of allocation each of those campsites had. And so we looked in each campground, the loops that required reservation and the loops that were available on a first come first serve basis. And importantly, we actually, I'm happy to talk about this later and geek out on it, but we actually were able to use Recreation.gov's reservation data to validate the reliability of our common evening phone locations, because for each reservation on rec.gov, there's actually a zip code of where people are coming from. So just to give you a visual here, here's Green River Campground and Dinosaur National Monument in Utah and Colorado. And so we took people's common evening locations, camping in Loop A and Loop C, and then separately Loop B. And we looked at where are these people coming from and what are the demographics of the census block groups where they're coming from. So what are the demographics of their home locales? And then we assessed differences. And importantly, we were just collecting the common evening location of people who were actually camping in the campground. And so we were looking at people whose phones were basically still through the night, maybe walking to the bathroom. And again, we're looking of those people's home locales, we're looking at the annual household income and the portion of white residency. And so looking specifically at income across our 5 campgrounds, here you can see listed the requiring reservations, the not requiring reservations available on a first come first serve basis here at Buckhorn Campground. And you can see the median household income of each. And then we also have the mean difference. And this mean difference is significantly different in 3 of the 5 campgrounds. And in each of the 5 campgrounds, the median household income of those people's home locales that are camping in sites that require reservations is higher than those available on a first come first serve basis. So the people camping in the campsites that require reservations are coming from areas that have higher household incomes than those that don't. And in some, it's really significant. Like Here, Loft Mountain Campground in Shenandoah National Park, it's $6,300 different, which is pretty massive. When you consider a state like mine, that's more than 10% of the median household income. And so this is a significant difference in terms of how much people, the affluence of where people are coming from that are getting their campsites. Again, the only difference between these campsites is how they're booked. They're identical otherwise. They have the same amenities. They have the same picnic tables. Just some were booked via reservations through these competitive systems, and some were booked through first come, first serve, which can also be competitive as well, but doesn't require the advanced planning as much. Then if we look at differences in race and portion of white residency, in that one urban proximate campground I talked about earlier in Prince William Forest Park, we actually see a significant difference here as well. So for instance, people camping in campsites requiring reservations come from home locales that have a portion of white residency around 64, 65%. And those camping in the first come, first serve, no reservation sites were coming from home locales on average with 58% white residency. So a whiter portion of campers in the campsites requiring reservations. And like I'll note, this is like pretty exploratory, right? Like this is published, it's peer reviewed, but like this is just one campground. All right. So big picture before I dive into some conclusions here. I think I'm pretty good on time. We'll have about maybe 14 more minutes. So these results suggest the reservation systems in the National Park Service and probably across other agencies as well serve as structural barriers to campsite use because it's so competitive that those with increased leisure time, increased incomes are more likely to get those sites. And this is troubling because as across the country, we're seeing camping becoming more diverse in these national park settings where just to get a campground is getting so competitive that camping may actually become more exclusive, opposite of the opposite trend. And this is important because this juxtaposes the very nature of our national parks. Those of you who love our parks, visit parks, we get beat over the head with this. And I love the fact that our national parks are for everyone, but these systems could be, again, presenting a structural barrier to national park recreation visitation. I'm about to play a clip from Ken Burns' National Parks, which is a big PBS documentary like all of Ken Burns by Robert Sterling Yard in 1922 about the nature of campgrounds in national parks. And we'll talk about what that means for today.
Already the national parks are beneficently affecting the national mind. In quite the same spirit as they do in their national parks. One sits at dinner, say, between a Missouri farmer and an Idaho miner, and at supper between a New York artist and an Oregon shopkeeper. One climbs mountains with a chance crowd from Vermont, Louisiana, and Texas, and sits around the evening campfire with a California grape grower, a locomotive engineer from Massachusetts, and a banker from Michigan. Here, the social differences so insisted on at home just don't exist. Perhaps for the first time, one realizes the common America and loves it. In the national parks, all are just Americans.
All right. If that doesn't rouse the spirit, I don't know what will. So that's like what our national parks were founded on. That's 1922. The national parks founded in 1916. It's this idea that this is a very democratic idea that everyone has access and we sit around the campfire and these class differences don't matter. And I just want to kind of ruminate on that for the rest of the talk here and keep that in the back of your mind. So just as a point of note, we could not replicate this study in 2022 because it's changing. So here's one of our campgrounds in Shenandoah National Park. And you can see that in 2019 on the left, these were the campsites that required reservations. And on the right, in 2022, these are the campgrounds that require reservations. It's more campgrounds, more campsites. And here in Oak Ridge Campground in Prince William Forest Park, the urban proximate park we looked at, In 2019, this is what the map looked like, where you had on the left those requiring reservations and about an equal amount on a first come first serve basis. And this is what the map looks like today. They're all reservation only. And a lot of this is because of staffing shortages. And like, this isn't, there's trade-offs to both systems, but there's no diversity in terms of how things are allocated. And so when we think about the results I presented and we think about, that yard quote and how things are moving, it can be kind of bleak. And so I want to spend the rest of the talk, last 10 minutes here, talking about solutions. And where do we turn for solutions? Well, I'm a big believer that whenever we're faced with a problem, especially in science, we really need to go back to the literature and look. Surely people have thought about these things in the past and just have a baseline to build from. And so when I'm thinking about this, I go back to Roger Clark and George Stanke. George Stanke, someone here in Missoula for a long time, really great social scientist, does not get his due, really creative thinker. They came up with this foundational framework in outdoor recreation research and management called the Recreation Opportunity Spectrum, which, as they write, seeks to maximize diversity. And diversity represents an important characteristic of any recreation system, they write. Managing opportunities for recreation to promote a diversity of experiences is crucial for social equity. Failing to provide diversity of opportunity invites charges of favoritism, elitism, and discrimination. So they're just saying we should provide diverse opportunities for different people with different interests, mountain bikers, hikers, first timers, experts. And I was just in Grand Canyon National Park on a project, and this is what the ROS, or the Recreation Opportunity Spectrum, looks like in Mather Campground at Grand Canyon right now. There's one loop, it's 10 only, no generators. It's nice if you want a quiet evening, you don't have to listen to generators humming, you want a more primitive experience, more solitude, more natural quiet. They have sites that you can bring your horses to. They have sites that you can bring more friends to, they're group sites. They have sites that are easier for larger RVs to accommodate. There are these little pull-through loops. They have sites that are available for people who are hiking in or biking into the park. But all of those sites are available 6 months in advance. There's no diversity in terms of how they're allocated, just in how they're, the types of activities, the types of things that are allowed aren't allowed. But in terms of how they're allocated, there's no diversity. That diversity that Clark and Stanke are saying is so important in 79 just isn't happening here in terms of allocation. And so what we're saying is, let's take that same concept and turn it to allocation. So sure, some sites can be remained to reserve 6 months in advance for those early birds, those people who can plan that far in advance, or maybe some are available 2 months in advance. People have that planning horizon. Some available 1 week in advance, but then some that are available on a daily lottery, like being trialed in Camp 4 in Yosemite National Park right now, or some good old fashioned first come first serve, but a diversity of allocation strategies. Additionally, going back to basics, we need to really think about, the type of management we have in campgrounds. So in outdoor recreation, research and management, we tend to think about management in 2 ways, direct management and indirect management. And park campgrounds are generally managed pretty directly. We tell people where they can camp, where they cannot camp, where your reservation allows you to camp, what you're allowed to bring into that campsite. There's lots of rules and regulations. But we also need to think about indirect management. And that's the type of management that doesn't just directly influence behavior, but actually influences the decision-making that leads to the behavior. And largely, as David Lime writes in the 70s, in 79 again, a very good year for recreation research apparently, a lot of that's education, or choosing more subtle ways, unobtrusive ways to manage campgrounds. But education is really key here, educating the broader public on how campsites are allocated and why they're allocated that way and the trade-offs that exist to different allocation strategies. Advertise those underutilized areas that aren't seeing as many campers, spread the love a little bit, and then educate the public about equity issues with recreation allocation. And this is an area that I'm going to close the talk on here today, looking at the work of 2 people I've really had the pleasure of working with the last year. That's Clarissa and Helena at UC Santa Barbara in their master's in environmental data science program. They've developed this app called the Outdoor Equity app. You can access it via this link. Basically, Clarissa and Helena created this app that allows you to visualize some of the inequities and answer questions of your own in terms of allocation. It's for managers and the general public to explore the data from Recreation.gov, this reservation data that I presented 2 papers on here today, and you can do the analysis at home for the state of California right now. And I'm just going to walk through some of those analyses really quickly. So for instance, if you were curious, how far in advance do I need to plan to be able to plan to book this campsite? If we look at lodgepole campgrounds at Quakings Canyon National Parks, it's basically 6 months in advance. You might be able to squeeze one in through a cancellation somewhere after that. But 6 months in advance is where you really should have your planning horizon, which is difficult. But if we go to a different campsite or a different campground, we can see that there's a lot more variation, one that's potentially less demanded. So we can figure out where we can camp, or as a manager, we can figure out where the demand is. We can look at what the racial representation of campers in a campground is. So here's a campground on Lake Tahoe, run by the National Forest. We can see an overrepresentation based on California residents in gray or green. Man, I'm like very colorblind, I apologize. But essentially we see overrepresentation of white visitors in a big way. But if we look at a different campground in the same national forest on the same lake, we see even higher overrepresentation. As a manager, you might say, okay, why is that? And you can dive into this data and try to figure out why exactly you have this larger overrepresentation or potentially a structural barrier to people of color. Additionally, we can see, okay, in any campground, how do people of varying incomes, how do their booking windows differ? And so this is pretty striking. This is Upper Pines Campground in Yosemite National Park. This highest income bracket, they're booking way in advance. But as we move down the income brackets, we're getting less and less in terms of the booking window. We're getting closer and closer. And largely, this is likely driven by the fact that people with lower incomes have jobs that don't have as much flexibility or built-in vacation or the security of knowing you'll be able to take a vacation at a certain date. And you may not know your schedule until 2 weeks out or 1 week out. And then lastly, or second to last, I guess penultimately, do visitors from different racial groups travel different distances to camp in our campground if you're a manager? And here we see, and this is a trend Clarissa and Helena found really across California, where Black campers were traveling a much farther distance in order to access these national park campgrounds. So you can dive into the data a little bit here as well. And then lastly, we can see the actual visitor shed. Where are people coming from? This is super exciting for managers. Where are people coming from? Where can we reach them? Who are we serving? This is a campground in the Marin Headlands, just north of San Francisco, across the Golden Gate Bridge. And you can see really density here in San Francisco, but other parts of the Bay Area, not so much. Certainly seeing some, but not as dense of visitation. So a couple takeaways. I think I'm 1 minute over and I apologize, but campgrounds, as I mentioned, have been really under-researched in the past, and that it's really exciting to see the tide turning, not only in the humanities, like Dr. Young's work, but also in the recreation literature. And part of that's because we now have access to big data, whether that's millions and millions of reservation records that are publicly available through Recreation.gov or cell phone data. We can start answering questions that we just haven't been able to answer in the past, and provide really quick insights to managers like Clarissa and Helena were able to do. And yeah, again, just super honored to be part of that project. And then lastly, this data can be used to help educate campers and reduce constraints to camping, as I showed you just now. And I'm going to close on this. This is a chart from a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. And they closed their article. They're talking about camping demand back in the 60s. They closed their article with a quote from Milton Friedman. And the quote is essentially, we should really, this problem of camping demand is a very simple one. Like, we just need to privatize it or raise prices. He goes on to say it's not a pricing dilemma. Like, essentially, like, you just need to raise the prices and then the shortage will be over, because only, some people want to pay $70, on this chart, $60, or sorry, what is it? Back then it was much lower, $5 to camp. But today it might be $60, but the thing is, these are public goods. These are public resources. And so we can't just raise the price. These aren't hotel rooms. So we really need to think about creative solutions to manage these beyond just using the market. And, you know, we have someone as brilliant as Milton Friedman, a Nobel laureate, who, you know, didn't quite grasp this in 1962, but it's really exciting that we have the academy at large, whether that's in the humanities or the social sciences or the data sciences, coming together to solve this problem using data in 2022. So I'll close there. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I think hopefully there's a little bit of time for questions now for those on Zoom.